that's Wolf on the left and Bessie on the right. The probable date that that picture was taken was probably about 1856. Just for the record, we'll put the date here. Actually, it's 2:58, not 3:58 Eastern Daylight Savings Time. Let's swing the camera around now. Pan it around, so they say. So where I'm going to sit, I'll be able to go into the details of the story of Bessie and, oh, get this back here. Story of Bessie and Wolf. Okay. Now we'll tighten this up. And go back. Okay. What did I say, 1856? Yes. That was taken in a town called Klebansk. Klebansk is located in what is now the borderline of Poland and Russia, or East Germany and Russia. In those days, one year, the town could be under the jurisdictions of the Russian, and then when they lose the war to the Lithuanians or the Swedes or whoever, it would become somebody else's territory, and then the Germans would come in, they'd take it. It was like a ping pong ball, back and forth. One day they belonged, one year they belonged to one country, and the next year another. It seems that in those days the Jews only had one name. For example, with Wolf, he'd be called Wolf the whiskey maker. He was a bootlegger. He was capable of putting together a good brew. I'm going to move a little over here because I think I'm slightly off center of the camera. So he would be known by that name, and the guy up the block who was a musician, it could be Itzik the fiddler, or Chaim the baker, and so on. They didn't have any second names. So it seems that around that time in the 1860s, the late 50s, the Tsar, in a gesture of benevolence, at least it looked like benevolence, actually it wasn't, decided that all the Jews shall heretofore have second names. Why? Because it made it easier for them to keep track of a family rather than individuals. Wolf, if he had a second name, there was maybe 101 different wolves in one town. But if they had a second name, it would narrow it down. So for tax purposes, it was easier for the tax collector to keep track of who to tax and where to find him. So why did Wolf take the name Klebansky? Well, his rationale apparently was as follows. The Russian word Klebansky, where you have the what is it, suffix? Shelley, this is in your ballpark. The suffix ski means son of. So he took the name Klebansky, the son of Koblan. He was born in Klebansky. Okay. Life was very, very difficult in those days. You didn't have TVs, you didn't have washing machines, you didn't have automobiles. Only the knights or the nobility had horses. And it was difficult to get around. And the probability is they worked probably 16 hours a day. And the net result was that at the end of the week, when there came a day of rest, the Sabbath, Shabbos, Saturday, or if you were a Christian, a Sunday, there was no ball games to go to. There was no baseball. There was no basketball. There was no recreation as we know it today. So what did the human being do? He had to escape. He had to find the world, particularly if you weren't part of the nobility. If you were just a peasant, which most of the people were, you'd get drunk. Subsequently, the man who had an inn where they served whiskey or a man who could brew a good jug of booze, he was a respectable member of society. Well, it seems one night, Wolf was brewing up a batch for a lot of his customers who were waiting patiently, probably a Saturday night. They were waiting for their booze, and they were getting impatient, but you couldn't rush them apparently. But outside in the snow, there were two police officers, and they saw all this smoke coming out of the chimney. And of course, it was a very cold climate there in Clarence. The winters were very, very severe, but there's a difference between the kind of smoke that will come from an ordinary fireplace, such as in your house on Lenox Avenue, and the billowing of the smoke coming from a still are two different things. And the police officers knocked on the door, gained entrance, and says, "Wolf, you're running a still here. We know you're running a still. We're going to find it. Show it to us or else." He says, "I don't have any still here." In the meantime, there was an argument, and the people who were his customers, who were on Wolf's side, were getting impatient because they were interfering with him taking care of his fire and so on. So they took the two police officers and they beat them up severely, they threw them out into the snow. They were unconscious. Wolf went about his business. He took care of his customers. They thanked him for the whiskey. They took off. Then he looked at Bessie. Bessie looked at him and said, "What are we going to do? They're going to find these police officers are missing. They're going to come around. We're going to be in big trouble. Big trouble indeed." So he and Bessie went out to the snow. They got the police officers, dragged them into the house, revived them, gave them some whiskey to warm them up a little bit, brought them around. When they saw that they were fit to travel, the two officers thanked them and they took off. The following morning, Wolf gets a visit from the chief of police. The chief of police says, "Look, as my two officers told me what you did last night, and I think it was a nice thing that you did. Humane, you deserve to be respected for it." He said, "However," he took his hand, he had something in his hand, and he slammed it on the table. He says, "But I have to arrest you." With that, he left the papers on the table, picked his hand up. He says, "However," or "but," he says, "I can't take you down to the police station now, but I'll be back at 5 o'clock to arrest you." And with that, he left. Wolf looks at Bessie, Bessie looks at Wolf. Naturally, he was scared. Now, Wolf could not read. He was illiterate. Bessie could read a little bit, enough to get by on. And she looks at the papers and he says, "Wolf," she says, "this is a passport. Maybe he's telling us to leave and leave in a hurry. He's coming back at 5. So with that in mind, they gathered what possessions they could carry, and they gathered their children, and they took off and they left. Eventually, they wound up in Scotland. My cousin Harold Miller visited Scotland a number of years ago. He came back with a story whereby this violin is involved. I don't know how the camera's picking this up, but it's old and battered. The extension here is gone. The strings aren't here. It needs a coat of lacquer. It's certainly not a Stradivarius, and it's certainly not an Amato, I don't know how you pronounce it. But there's quite a story behind it. It seems that, I'm going to digress a minute, then I'll lead back to this story because it is relative. For years, my mother and my father's sister, Agnes, my Aunt Agnes, were bitter enemies. And they were fighting like hell. I don't know exactly what they were fighting about. But there was one possession my mother had, or my father had, that my mother would not give her. My father had a violin. My father used to play the violin. And she wanted that violin. And I couldn't figure out why. Eventually, as time gets us all, my mother passed on in 1960. My father still had the violin. It was packed away in a closet in the condition that it is right now. When he passed away in 1965 and I had to go through his possessions, he lived in a place called Parkside Avenue, which Shelley, you'll remember it. Lynn might remember it. Of course, Mark and Debbie, you can't remember it. You weren't here yet. At any rate, this was one of the things that I came across, and I took it and I packed it away up in the attic here. You know what's up in the attic here. Gathering dust, and for 30 winters it's been up there. About 2 months before my father's unveiling, before we officially opened the monument at his graveside, Agnes contacted me and asked me if I still had the old violin. I said, yes. She says, may I have it? As a keepsake. I said, well, certainly. And I didn't attach any significance to what the thing was all about. And finally I gave it to her at the gravesite. And I says, please make a donation in my father's memory to your temple, which she never did. Eventually, I raised a fuss about it, and I got the violin back. Now, let's get to the connection between this violin and Wolf. Harold came back and he told me the story that when Wolf was courting Bessie, and Bessie finally said, yes, I will marry you, he was so elated that he grabbed his violin and he fiddled a good part of the day away. He was so happy. Now, I can't prove it, but I'm willing to bet everything that I got that this violin is the violin that your great-great-grandfather, Wolf, played when Bessie consented to marry him. Just let me check how much time I have left on the camera here. I got about 5 minutes left. I had to check that because I didn't know whether I was talking to myself or not. You only get 1,200 frames on the camera here. Let's get back to Wolf's day. How did he come to Russia? I can't trace our heritage back any further than that. But they are up near the Baltic Sea, Kobansk. And if you want to look at a map, there is one in this book here. Conveniently, I have this thing here to show me. By scale of miles, I'd have to say that it's over 1,000 miles from the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And those two seas being just to the northeast of Constantinople and Turkey. Now, it would seem to me that with transportation being being very, very difficult back in those years, for a family to move from what is known now as Israel, Palestine in those days, to move from there all the way up to Kobansk, would take several generations. They didn't have any choo-choo trains. Trains first came into around the mid-1800s, becoming a practical way to travel about, but they certainly didn't reach Russia yet. So in this book here, I found a story about the Khazars. I'm going to read it to you briefly. Around the year 600, a belligerent tribe of half-Mongolian people, similar to the modern Turks, had conquered the territory of what is now southern Russia. Before long, the kingdom of the Khazars, as this tribe was known, stretched from the Caspian to the Black Sea. Its capital city was at the mouth of the Volga River. The Khazars mingled with the native Slavic population. Jewish, Christian, and Mohammedan merchants visited them, and these cultural contracts had cultural results. Sometime during the 8th century, the Khazar king and nobility became civilized enough to want to abandon their pagan worship and adopt a religion about which the visitors from neighboring lands to the south used to tell them. But which religion was it to be? The merchants from the Byzantine Empire urged Christianity upon them. The merchants from Persia urged them to adopt Mohammedanism. Both of these were the religions of the mighty conquering kingdoms, the Byzantine and the Mohammedans. Each argued that God was on its side. Apparently, each of these religions won a large number of adherents among the Khazars. But the royal family and the largest number of the nobility were impressed with Judaism. That was the religion they adopted, though they did not force it upon others. It's my belief that probably we came from the Khazars. Now, why my father, Nathaniel K. Miller, used the K, I don't know. Whether it was for the word Klebansky, or whether he also was aware of these Khazars. And the K in his middle initial might be for one of the other reasons. I'd have to guess it's from Klebansky, but it very well could be from the Khazars. These Khazars were highly intelligent people, but they were very, very warlike. From a heritage standpoint, a genealogical standpoint, you got to look today. You know, the Christian world looks upon the Jew as someone who will walk away from a fight. Yes, we walk away from many a fight because our common sense tells us that it's the more sensible thing to do. However, from a courage standpoint, and from a standpoint of being able to fight back, take a look at what the Israeli army did when they were outnumbered like 100 to 1 during the 1948 war, 47 war, during the Yom Kippur War. Look at how we've had to fight to survive down through the centuries. During Old Wolf's time, our time, Debbie and Mark, you're probably not aware of it. You probably feel that there aren't undercurrents and that we're being given an ample opportunity to work and to live. But in his day, it was something different. But going back even further than that, history shows us, and I'd like to find any man in the church to deny this because it is so recorded. The Vatican and Rome knows it. They won't deny it if you push them against the wall. But there was a pope by the name of Innocent III. He existed during the year of 1215. At 1215, the year 1215, he forced the usage of yellow patches of material on the front of a garment and the back of the garment of a Jew, so that people will be able to know who they are and to shun them and to avoid them. That's my interpretation, though. But the forcing of them to wear it, he did it. That's all recorded. Later on, when the Mohammedans started to harass the Christians, they did the same thing to the Christians. But the Christians, in turn, turned around and did it to the Jews. In 1239, there was a pope by the name of Gregory IX. He confiscated all the books of the Talmud and had them burnt. He took all the Jewish books he could find, particularly the Talmud, had a bonfire with them. Pius VI, in the year 1775, he forced the Jews to attend compulsory services on Sunday at the churches that the Christians had. They're trying to convert us whether we wanted to or not. We all know what happened in 1492. This was the year that Columbus took off to discover America. There was the Inquisition, which is a word that the Christians would like to forget. They took 500,000 Jews, 500,000 Jews, uprooted them from Spain and just made them get out unless they converted to Catholicism. If they converted, and many of them did, but they practiced Judaism secretly. If they discovered that and they did discover many of them who were practicing Judaism, although that they said that they had converted to Christianity, they would burn them at the stake. They called that auto de fe. Shelley, you can correct my pronunciation if it's incorrect. It's an act of faith, they call it. I don't know why they call it an act of faith, but a lot of Jews were burned purely because they didn't want to follow a religion that they really didn't believe in. In 1858, Pius IX, he allowed the kidnapping of Jewish infants so as they could be brought up as Christians. How do you like that? Going back to 1555, there was Paul IV. These are all popes, the head of the church. And he had a ferocious anti-Jewish edict which forced the Jews to live in ghettos. They had to live in a certain area, and they had to be in at a certain time at night, and if they were locked out, God help them.